Welcome to Brain Pain, where we discuss everything psychology. I'm John, and as I always remind you, I am not a psychologist, I'm not a therapist, I am simply a guy with a master's degree in psychology who is working on his PsyD. Nothing I say here is meant to replace therapy. I encourage you, if you're struggling, if you're having a rough time, seek some help. See what's going on with yourself. So today, I originally was just going to talk about vision and how we perceive things through vision. But once again, I went down the rabbit hole. And I ended up connecting a few things that make sense to me and always have, but I wanted to go through them and talk about them a little bit. So let's start with perception in general. Perception is subjective. That means that two people can look at the same thing and they will see different things. And they might not even see different things. They may see the same thing but interpret what they saw differently. This is a common thing when you hear about a crime that was witnessed by multiple witnesses. Each witness will tell a completely different story, and they'll get several different descriptions of the same individual. And that's because each person perceives the situation differently. Things that they focus on are different. What they see, while the same... Let me back up. Light reflects off a surface. When that happens, that reflected light enters our eyes, and through a complex, very complex series of events, and that reflected light is turned into an image, and our brain sorts it out and interprets what we're seeing. Like I'm looking right ahead of me right now. As I look straight ahead, I see a camera. But the reality is, when I look straight ahead, in my mind, I see people. So I don't actually even always see exactly what's in front of me, because I'm imagining some of my friends sitting on the other side of that camera and looking at me, and that's who I'm talking to. I'm talking to a friend. So if you're listening, I'm talking to a friend. And since you're the one who's listening, that friend must be you. But back to the topic. So there's a lot of questions that scientists ask about perception. One of the easiest to conceive of is color. So I've been told what the color green looks like. So when I look at the color green, I say, oh, that's green. And someone standing next to me may say, yep, that color is green. But we know for a fact that subjectively, if I could see through that other person's eyes, when I look at the color green, it might not look green. It might look red or blue or yellow to me, what I understand in my brain that green looks like. Now, we both identify that color as green because objectively it is the same color. Have I got you confused yet? So what I'm saying is, I may see the color green as what I perceive as green. The other person may see the color green as what I perceive as red. But we both agree that it's green because we have been told and taught that this reflected light that we're seeing is green. That's a really basic concept that gets very convoluted and difficult to explain very quickly. Imagine how much harder it can get to describe complex feelings and occurrences. So as I looked at perception, and I looked at color as an example, I found some interesting things. And that sent me down another rabbit hole. So there's a theory that humans could only recently, in human existence, see the color blue. And I'll go into that in a little more detail because it was done linguistically. In other words, they looked for the history of the word blue or something that would mean blue, and they found that it's only relatively recently that we find this term for the color blue. So I went a little bit further, and I said, well, what's the oldest recorded language? Well, that wasn't nearly as important as what I found out. What I found out is that it appears that language was invented 4 separate times independently. So this takes me back to perception. Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and southern Mexico near Guatemala is where the 4 centers of language that were originally created existed. Now, there's some question as to if Egypt was influenced by Mesopotamia, but it is pretty commonly accepted that the idea of a written language was about the only influence that they would have received from Mesopotamia because the basis and structure of the language is so different. The very fundamentals of the language are different. So we had a common idea of taking spoken words that represent things and actions and putting them in a form that could be read. So written, whether it's not painted on a wall, it doesn't really matter the medium. But the idea is you would have symbols that represent words or speech or letters that could be assembled into having a meaning of a word that would be an item or an action, etc. But all 4 times it was created so very differently that it is obvious to people who study languages. Now, this could be caused by a number of things. Those of you who've been listening for a while know I'm a fan of epigenetics, which means our genes express things in a unique way based on our environment. And as such, so inventing language, which the idea of drawing words is not, the language seems so common to us and writing language seems so common to us, but it was a pretty new thing back in the day. But it was invented 4 times and so very differently. So the perception of how to take these, sounds and make them into a picture very dramatically. Now some will say, oh, well, languages were very different. True. But so I have an idea of, I can say I need in English, right? I need. And in Russian, it's мне нужно. It means the same thing. It's a common concept in the human existence, but 2 very different ways of expressing it. People who perceived this very differently. These languages came from people who saw sounds that represented something very differently. I mean, think about I like something. In Russian, it's я хочу. In Spanish, it's me gusta. Right? And if I'm hatcheting a foreign language, please forgive me. These are the ways I learned these words. We have these things that mean the same things, but they're expressed very differently on a linguistic level. If you've ever seen the Russian language, you'll understand that the alphabet is completely different. And I mean, you've seen this throughout history. There were a few different alphabets. But it all comes back to this concept of perception being subjective. So there's evidence that we didn't see the color blue until relatively recently. And this was when this was first started by William Gladstone, who noticed that in the book The Odyssey by Homer, The ocean is described as wine dark. Not blue, but wine dark. So then a few years later, a gentleman who studies languages named Lazarus Geiger followed up, and he observed and analyzed ancient Icelandic, Hindu, Chinese, Arabic, and Hebrew texts, and there was no mention of the word blue. Now, there's a couple flowers that are blue, and the sky is blue, and the ocean could be considered blue when it's not green. Shallow water tends to be green. So maybe there weren't a real need for the color blue. Matter of fact, the first society that had the word was the Egyptians, and it is suggested that it's because they were the first civilization to be able to make blue dye. So that until you could see blue, you didn't have a word for it. Or until you had a word for it, you couldn't see it, depending on if the chicken or the egg comes first. Now, some people say, oh, well, they could probably just didn't have a word for it, yada, yada, yada. You still saw it. But it was interesting because Jules Davidoff, a psychologist from Goldsmiths University of London, worked with the Himba tribe from Nambia. And what they did is this tribe has no word for the color blue. And they showed them, was it 12? They showed them 11 green squares and one blue square. So there were 12 squares in a circle. One of them was clearly blue. And they really struggled to see which square looked different. They dug a little further and found out the tribe has multiple words for the word green. So what they did is they took 12 squares and they took one that was slightly different shade of green, and the tribe could pick it out every time very quickly, all of them, there was no question. When they showed it to people from Western cultures, they really couldn't tell the difference. And I looked at them, I couldn't tell the difference either. Now this is, if you go to sciencealert.com and look up humans didn't see the color blue, you'll find the article. And let me see if I can tell you who wrote the article. The article is, there's evidence humans didn't actually see blue until modern times, by Fiona McDonald, and that was the 7th of April, 2018. Interesting article, and it just goes to show. So I start to think, in this concept of subjective perception, how do we talk to somebody who cannot perceive what we perceive? How do you tell someone from the tribe to go pick the blue iris flower? There's a blue iris flower. I need a blue iris flower. Can you go get the blue flower? Blue has no meaning. They don't even see it. They just see shades of green. How do you communicate? Now, I leave that there to show you that communication between two individuals can be difficult if you're from extremely different backgrounds and areas of the world, and we already know that. But a lot of that is because our perceptions of the exact same thing are different. That's because we have different motivations, we have different understandings, we have different norms. And so then we have to talk about empathy. How do we have empathy for people we don't understand? Well, I mean, for me, I would suggest that we start by trying to understand their position, understand their motivation. We're not going to understand everything about everyone. There's some people we'll never really understand at all. I have a number of people that I've met that are a complete mystery to me. Now, I'm not very close to them, but that's, I'm sure, as much their choice as it is mine. We just do not live in the same, it seems like we don't live in the same universe. We obviously do, we just perceive it very differently. And I see this a lot with some relationship things that happen. Now, I know a number of women who have had kind of the same story. Details are different, but the same story, I hear it over and over. It has to do with some guy contacting them and it ending terribly. And what typically happens is it goes something like this, and you may know people that have seen this. You may be someone who's been through this on one end or the other. There's some guy who reaches out and introduces themselves on a forum that is proper for you to do so. I've seen it on chat rooms. I've seen it in on Twitch, which is a site for gaming, if you don't know, where you watch someone who plays a game typically or does something else, like music, or sometimes it's just chatting. But those are forums where you should introduce yourself. You should have conversation. And then the relationship gets weird. And it gets weird because the guy says things and overreaches and doesn't adhere to boundaries that are set by the individual. I mean, I'm sure this happens to guys too. It's just I hear about it from the women that I know, good friends of mine. And then eventually that person has to be blocked from their social media because they become rude and really possessive and display some pretty abhorrent behavior. Now, why is that? Well, it's a combination of a couple things. First of all, I think that the women don't understand the men's perception. So we understand their motivation. The guy's lonely. He's a lonely guy who wants connection with a female. And as such, the women are nice to these guys. They just want to be nice. What they don't get is that this guy perceives that as, hey, they're attracted to me. They want to be close to me. Even when at that point the women are saying things like, hey, no, it's cool to be friends. Hey, well, I hope the best for you, buddy. But these guys blow right past that as hey, because they're so desperate for a connection. Right? And so what happens is the individual doesn't realize that these online connections are, I think the best description of it I've heard is cotton candy. There's something there, but there's not a lot of substance. But this is what they have because they don't know how to go interact. They haven't had success doing face-to-face friendships, relationships, any of that. And the woman in this scenario feels that she's being compassionate. She's having empathy for the individual by trying to be nice to him, and inadvertently he perceives that as encouragement to continue to pursue her. Then when she has to start being firm and saying, this is not what I'm interested in, it gets ugly, and there's a whole scenario that if you haven't ever heard about it or witnessed it, it's all over the internet. You can find out about these kind of things. But I was watching a streamer, and I recently saw her say, very bluntly, I have no interest in being friends with you outside of this forum. I don't want to meet you. I don't want to talk to you on the phone. Here we can chat. Here we can be friends. And I thought about that because a lot of people thought she was being very harsh. Others thought she was just setting her boundaries, but I think she understood the person's perspective. And she had to correct his perspective. She understood what he was thinking. He was thinking there was some possibility that out of the hundreds of people chatting in that room, that even though she'd never seen him and she'd talked to him for maybe 2 minutes, that there was some connection that would lead to some deeper meaning. And I'm not saying there never could happen, but what I'm saying is she wanted to make sure he understood that was not what was happening. And she wanted to be very clear. And I thought that was great. That short-term letdown, or maybe even some embarrassment, would prevent him from making things bad for both of them. Now, chances are, from what I've seen, this guy probably went to another streamer and just started the same thing. Because they're so desperate that they just want the attention. They want to feel like they're connected, and they don't have a good handle on what a relationship should be like with other adults. I'm not even talking about romantically. I'm just meaning other relationships with adults. And that's why they're so lonely, because they've grown up in this artificial online existence that, again, there's no substance. Whereas making friends and going to do things in person, well, there's a whole bunch of neurological stuff that happens. But I'm getting back to perspective because I want to talk a little bit about empathy with that. So this is a stranger who's never physically met this person. The other person hasn't actually ever met or even seen them. All they've seen are some words on a screen. And somehow the individual believes that there is some deeper relationship. That perspective is way off of what the perspective of the recipient of that adoration is. And it should be set straight immediately. In my opinion, that's the best way to deal with it. But that's where the problem becomes, because people don't, and it is a matter of not understanding the other person's perception. Therefore, you don't really have empathy. You might have sympathy. You might feel bad for them, but you don't understand how they feel. You just feel bad for them because they don't see the picture. Another thing I see on a number of fronts is communication with family members that does not go well. And it's because they don't understand the other person's point of view or their perception of the reality they're in. How many times have you heard about an adult making a decision and their kids or their sisters or their brothers or even their parents really frustrated? And so they start telling them what they should do, or they start telling them how it's going to impact the family, or just go down the list, right? Oftentimes this means there is no empathy. It means they don't understand where that person is coming from. It means they don't understand how that individual perceives their own life and what would cause them to make that decision. How many times have we seen people turn to drugs or alcohol abuse, or abuse of anything, because they lack self-esteem? Okay, I'm going to cut that story out. So I was going to tell you a story about a specific friend of mine that I haven't seen in a long time, who I hope is doing well. But I felt that was, it might be too easy to identify that individual. I haven't seen them in years. But I will tell you a story that is similar. because I've heard it many times. Daughter has a bad relationship with her father, sometimes her mother too. Doesn't feel self-worth, doesn't feel self-value, doesn't feel beautiful, doesn't feel important. No self-esteem. Ends up on drugs because can't deal with the reality of being the person they are. So we always go, oh, well, those parents weren't good parents. And the parents may not have been good parents. It doesn't matter which one you're talking about. But the other thing is, how many of those parents had children before they should have? How many of those parents saw this as a big mistake because they weren't ready and they were unprepared and all these other things that they may perceive? Now, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. What I'm saying is it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. It's how they perceived it. And if someone had been able to help them change their perception, they may have been able to make better choices, and perhaps that daughter may have turned out better, or may have turned out to at least not be using drugs and have a satisfying life. Now, I'm using the term daughter because I know several stories of females who've gone through this, specifically with the self-esteem issues. And most of them I have not seen in years, and I hope they're doing well. It's very common to see children who are unhappy with what decisions their adult parents make after the children are adults. I watched this in friends of mine. Parent moved to Florida, made some decisions that they weren't happy with. Fortunately, they were adult enough to say they're adults, they can make their own decision. I'm not happy with it, but it's not my decision to make. And I'll just be available if they need me. And hopefully that's the kind of decisions we can make. We can understand the motivation of someone else that they're making their... Now, I'm talking about adults here. I'm not talking about children. Children need correction. They need guidance a lot more than... And not that adults don't, but we also have to understand that correction and guidance from another adult, it's more like guidance or suggestions because that adult is going to make their decisions. And it's all based on their perception. And I guess all of this really is to tie into the idea that if you are coming to a conflict, identifying where that other person is coming from may help you resolve it. It may not make you friends. It may not make you like each other. But if you can understand their motivations, and their motivations come from how they perceive the situation, you may be able to improve your own life by navigating these conflicts or even navigating a good relationship. By being able to say, oh, well, I understand that while I disagree with them, they're seeing it from this viewpoint because of their previous experience or whatever it is. By having an understanding of other people's perception, you can have some empathy to understand where they're coming from and why. You may not agree with it. You still may not like them. But again, it may make your life or their life or both of your lives better. All right, well, that's what I have for today. Remember that I love you. Take care of yourself. Rock on.